Russo had never liked birthday celebrations. Over the years, she'd learned to keep things simple: a quiet dinner with Jason, an impromptu candle on dessert, and maybe a glass of wine in the kitchen. No parties, no expectations. That low-key routine was, in reality, a form of peace. That's why her mother's call the day before seemed so out of place. She used a soft, overly friendly tone that didn't match her usual style. She told her she'd been sent a surprise. Just that, not an early happy birthday. Not a personal statement, a reminder. Almost like someone giving a supermarket delivery. And yet, there was something more in that voice. Something that smelled of calculation. Russo hung up and was silent for a few seconds. It wasn't just discomfort. It was a warning her body picked up before her mind. The next morning, the package arrived early. It was a medium-sized, unadorned box, without a single note, with an anonymous sender from a P.O. box. Jason, who was home, noticed it. First, he picked it up with both hands, turned it slightly, weighed it, and frowned. "This is weird," he said bluntly. And he was right. The weight didn't match the size. The sealing was clumsy, as if done in a hurry, and the shipping label looked digitally assembled. Russo walked over, and upon touching the edge of the box, he immediately recognized the texture of the protective plastic and the type of tape, the same ones he used to see in his sister Ellie's apartment. It all came back to him. All at once, all those times when Ellie tried to sell him supposedly exclusive decorative pieces, but they were nothing more than poorly packaged trinkets. That tiny, almost insignificant detail set off all his alarm bells. He still didn't know what was inside, but something told him he should proceed with caution. Russo didn't open the box. Instead, he placed it on the kitchen counter and stared at it as if he expected it to move on its own. Jason didn't insist, but he didn't back away either. I knew him well enough to know he was uncomfortable too. A few minutes later, Russo picked up the phone and called his mother. He feigned enthusiasm, as if he'd already opened the gift. He said it was an unexpected gesture and that it had surprised him. While he was talking, without his mother's knowledge, he activated the cell phone recorder. On the other end, the woman responded with rehearsed sweetness, repeating that everything had been done with love. She didn't ask if he liked it. She didn't mention what was inside. She only emphasized more than once that the shipment was a token of affection, as if she wanted to leave that phrase embedded in the conversation. That same afternoon, around 5 o'clock, there was a knock at the door. They were two plainclothes police officers, displaying a search warrant. They had received an anonymous report about a suspicious package delivered to that address. Russo, already sensing something wasn't right, let them in without hesitation. Jason stayed by his side the entire time. One of the officers visually inspected the box before carefully opening it, wearing gloves. Inside, they found several decorative pieces, small, striking sculptures, but what really caught their attention were the serial codes marked on the bases of some of them. The officer made a call, dictated the numbers in a low voice, and after hanging up, looked at Russo seriously. Those objects were linked to an open investigation into an illegal art import ring. No one in that house said a word. The silence weighed like lead. The following hours were a whirlwind of questions, documents, and statements. Russo handed over her ID, allowed access to her emails, and voluntarily showed her phone. While the agents analyzed the data, one of them asked to review the business records registered in her name. It was then that the first big surprise emerged. Russo was listed as the co-founder of a decorative arts company based in another state. The company had suspicious transactions, cash transfers from international accounts, and several exports halted due to irregularities. The most serious thing was discovering that her signature appeared on the incorporation documents, along with Ellie's. Russo was shocked. She had never signed anything related to her sister's business. She had never agreed to be part of anything. The agents were quick to connect the dots. When they asked about Ellie, Russo didn't deny it. He explained her shaky history, her consistently poorly executed business ideas, her ability to manipulate and lie even to his own parents. He also mentioned how, years ago, Ellie had asked to use his address for one delivery only and how, to avoid conflict, Russo hadn't refused at the time. But this was different. This was serious. At the end of the interview, the agents secured the box and promised to contact her with more information. That night, Russo couldn't sleep. She didn't even try. She sat in the living room with Jason, mentally reviewing every detail, every past conversation with her sister, every moment she'd hesitated and said nothing. She felt anger, yes, but above all, she felt betrayal, a carefully planned betrayal. The next day, Russo received a call from the lead investigator. They had confirmed that the products found at her home were part of a larger batch seized at a port of entry months earlier. The company's name was listed as the intermediary in at least 3 questionable shipments, and she, according to the documents, was legally responsible for the tax registration. But what was most disconcerting was what came next. The seized documents contained a scanned copy of her passport and signature. Both were near-perfect forgeries. The investigator was blunt. Someone close to her had orchestrated all this with access to highly personal information. Russo felt a sinking feeling in her stomach. It was impossible for this to have been done without the complicity of someone who knew every one of her private details. Only her family had access to that level of detail. That afternoon, Russo and Jason met with a lawyer. It wasn't a dramatic, shouty conversation. It was technical, cool, and punctual. The lawyer explained that even though she had no direct involvement, being listed in the records as the founder could cause legal problems, especially if she didn't act quickly. He asked her to gather proof that she wasn't aware of the company's existence, as well as evidence of her distant relationship with the family. Russo showed him the recording of the call with her mother, and also some old messages where Ellie spoke vaguely about business. The lawyer listened attentively, and at the end, he said something that made her shiver. This wasn't an oversight. This is a blame-shifting operation, and you're the scapegoat. Jason silently squeezed her hand. Russo, on the other hand, didn't react, because deep down, he already knew. The following days were a mix of bureaucracy, silent tension, and a deep sense of disbelief. Russo began compiling everything that might prove her unrelated to the matter: employment contracts, emails, bank statements. She also reviewed old conversations with her mother and sister, looking for any trace of prior tampering. It was in that process that she found an email she hadn't given much thought to at the time. A message from Ellie, a year old, asking her to sign a generic authorization to use her address commercially for tax purposes. Russo hadn't signed it, but the document she found attached to that email was the same one that now appeared in the official records, only with a forged signature. The feeling that her identity had been so casually taken hit her harder than any insult. They had used her as if she had no voice. Finally, one morning, she received confirmation that Ellie had been detained for questioning. At the same time, investigators revealed that her parents were also being questioned for having been linked to bank transactions connected to the company. Russo didn't know whether to feel relief or sadness. For years, she had kept a safe distance from them, but a part of her always believed that, despite everything, some real connection still remained. That idea completely crumbled when the investigator shared a fragment of a recorded phone call between her parents and Ellie. There, in a dry voice, her mother said that Russo was always the strong one and that, if things went wrong, she would know how to handle it. The phrase wasn't just an emotional stab. It was a brutal confirmation that she had been betrayed, calculatedly, without remorse. Russo didn't cry. She didn't scream. She didn't throw things or curse at anyone. She just sat in her kitchen, staring into a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. Jason paced silently around the house, making calls, organizing paperwork, keeping her company without pressure. There was something deeply painful about that stillness. It was like watching a building collapse in slow motion. Inside, Russo felt like something had permanently broken. It wasn't just Ellie's betrayal or her parents' cruel indifference. It was the realization that, for years, she'd been sustaining an illusion of family that didn't exist. All that time believing her distance was a form of self-protection, when in reality she was just postponing disaster. When she finally decided to confront them, she did so with surgical precision. She wasn't looking for a scandal, a reconciliation, or an explanation that would fix everything. She just wanted clear answers. She called her parents from the lawyer's office, the speakerphone on and the conversation being recorded. She asked them point blank why they'd made her a partner without her consent. What she heard was the closest thing she'd ever get to a confession. Her mother, with chilling coldness, said Ellie couldn't handle another investigation, that she had children, a family that depended on her. and that Russo, without them, could handle the consequences better. Her father, for his part, simply said that there was no other option. At that moment, Russo understood there was nothing left to salvage. No one was going to take the blame. They'd chosen her because they believed she wouldn't break, because they thought her strength was an advantage to them. After that call, Russo never contacted them again. He didn't answer any more messages, didn't open subsequent emails, or respond to any of the hints that began circulating from distant relatives on social media. He made himself invisible to that part of his story, not out of cowardice, but out of self-preservation. Through his lawyer, he ensured he legally distanced himself from anything related to the fraudulent company. He filed charges for identity theft, provided the recordings and emails, and cooperated at every stage of the investigation. Ellie eventually accepted a plea deal that involved pleading guilty in exchange for a reduced sentence. Her parents, for their part, were sentenced to community service and a substantial fine for accessory after the fact. None of this brought him immediate peace, but it was a necessary closure. The day she received the final document officially releasing her from all legal responsibility, Russo didn't celebrate. She just walked to the kitchen, placed 2 cups of coffee on the table, and sat across from Jason. The sun streamed in through the window like any other day. There were no toasts, no tears, no grand words, just one sentence spoken in a low but firm voice. I'm ending it. Jason didn't ask what. He understood. It wasn't just the end of a legal process. It was the end of a relationship, of an invisible burden she'd carried her entire life. That ending held no anger or drama. It had dignity. And in that shared silence, Russo began to rebuild herself, not from hatred, but from the relief of having finally chosen herself. For weeks, Russo worked to erase every digital trace of her family. She deleted contacts, changed passwords, reviewed bank account permissions, and made sure no one else had access to her documents. It wasn't paranoia. It was caution learned the hard way. She also changed the emergency number on her medical record, replacing her mother with a close friend. Each small act of cutting felt like pulling rotten roots from a tree that still wanted to grow. She was surprised to discover how much she'd left open out of habit, how many doors she'd kept ajar, hoping even if she didn't know it that things would someday change. But that day wasn't coming, and for the first time, she was okay with that. Jason was her anchor throughout the entire process. He didn't offer platitudes. He didn't try to rush her grief. He was just there, constant, firm, without asking for explanations she wasn't ready to give. Sometimes just sharing a moment of silence in the car or cooking a meal together was enough. For Russo to feel that, even though her biological family had betrayed her, she still had a home. They didn't talk about it much, but when it came up, he looked at her with that mix of pride and tenderness that sustained her so much. One night, while they were washing dishes, Jason asked her if there was anything she wanted back from that relationship with her parents or with Ellie. Russo calmly dried her hands, looked him in the eyes, and answered without hesitation, I just want my peace of mind back. And in that moment, she knew she was achieving it, step by step, without show, just with truth. It wasn't until several months later that Russo again passed near the neighborhood where she grew up. She had unconsciously avoided those streets, as if her body knew she needed physical distance to sustain her emotional one. This time it wasn't planned. She simply took a shortcut to avoid traffic and suddenly found herself in front of the old bakery where her mother had taken her as a child. She didn't feel nostalgia, just a kind of clean emptiness, like when you realize you no longer need something to live. She paused for a few seconds on the corner, observing the place neutrally, and then continued on her way. There was nothing to look for there, nothing to repair. It had been part of her history, yes, but it didn't have to remain part of her present. At home that same day, she found a box she didn't remember putting away. It was at the back of the closet, behind a stack of old folders. When she opened it, she found childhood photos, letters, small family mementos she had set aside years ago without much thought. For a moment, she hesitated. Then she took them one by one and began to separate them. Some she put in a new folder, the ones that reminded her of who she was before the manipulation, before the weight. Others she simply tore up, without hate, without ceremony, just like someone clearing a room to let some air in. It wasn't about erasing the past, but about redefining it, about no longer allowing it to dictate the course of her identity. It was the first time in a long time that she felt completely in control of her own story, and it was a powerful feeling. Russo began to notice changes in the way she related to people. Before, she was always on high alert, with that constant tension of someone waiting for the next emotional blow. Now, little by little, she was able to relax. She went for walks without looking at her phone every minute. She enjoyed conversations with her friends without feeling the need to justify anything. Even at work, her concentration had improved. She no longer carried that invisible weight that wore her down. It wasn't that everything had disappeared overnight, but something in her had hardened and, at the same time, liberated. She was no longer afraid to say no when something didn't feel right, and that, for someone who had always been the strong one out of obligation, felt like a discovery. One night, while organizing her documents in a digital folder, Russo found the recording of that first call with her mother, the one with the supposed gift. She listened to it through her headphones in silence. It was strange, almost surreal. Remembering the exact moment everything began to fall apart. Her mother's voice, sweet and false, no longer hurt her as it had before. She listened to it like someone watching a scene from someone else's movie. For the first time, she understood that that voice didn't define who she was, nor her worth, nor her strength. She turned off the recording, filed it in a folder called Closure, and closed her computer. There was no resentment, no sadness, just a deep feeling of having crossed an internal boundary from which she never intended to return. As the days passed, Russo began sharing parts of her story in small circles. She didn't do so seeking sympathy, nor to dramatize what had happened. She simply spoke when she felt her experience could help. Others identify the limits of the silent abuse that sometimes hides behind the label family. She discovered that many people carried painful TIs they didn't know how to let go. Listening to her, some burst into tears, others silently thanked her. And although at first she felt exposed, over time she understood that speaking out was also healing. That naming what she had experienced didn't make her a victim, but someone who had survived without losing her essence. Jason encouraged her to write about what she had experienced, not to publish it, nor to turn it into a grandiloquent testimony, but as a way to bring order to the chaos that had surrounded her. Thus was born the first version of the story that she would later share on an anonymous forum. At first, she hesitated. What if someone didn't believe her? What if they thought she was exaggerating? But then she reminded herself that she wasn't writing to be validated. She did it because there were too many people like her, silent, thinking they were the only ones experiencing something like this. She finished the text one night, uploaded it without a signature, closed her computer, and went to sleep. She wasn't expecting anything, but when she woke up, she had dozens of messages from people saying one thing: "Thanks for sharing this. It made me feel less alone." And in that silent echo, Russo knew she had done the right thing. The last time someone tried to contact her on behalf of her family, it was through an email sent from an unknown account. It said something vague, with no real apology. "We all make mistakes, and life is too short to hold grudges." Russo read it only once, feeling nothing. There was no more anger, no more sorrow, not even surprise. She deleted it without responding, because she understood, with a clarity that took her years to achieve, that forgiveness doesn't always mean getting back together, that some bonds to heal must end completely. There was no hatred in her decision, only a definitive calm, like closing a door knowing you no longer need to look through the crack. In her new routine, Russo found pleasure in small gestures: making coffee ahead of time, walking barefoot around the house, reading without interruptions. She had regained the right to be quiet without having to justify every step. Sometimes, in moments of silence, she still felt a pang of what had been, not out of nostalgia, but because of the magnitude of what she left behind. But even that was beginning to hurt less, like a scar that no longer burns, it only remembers. And in the midst of that simple and honest life, she discovered a new way of belonging, not to a family out of obligation, but to herself, by choice. One day, as Jason watered the plants on the balcony and the sound of water filled the kitchen, Russo found herself smiling for no reason. Not because of anything extraordinary, but because she'd reached a point where everyday life no longer hurt. She'd spent so much time in defense mode, waiting for the next blow, that forgetting what it felt like to be at peace had become part of her normality. That smile was small, almost imperceptible, but it meant a lot to her. It was the first clear sign that her body was also beginning to let go, that she no longer had to be on constant alert, that she could live her own life without fear of being betrayed from within her own family. That night, while they were having dinner, Jason asked her if she wanted to do anything special for her upcoming birthday. Russo looked up, thought for a few seconds, and said she didn't need anything big. "I just want to be with you at home, no surprises," she replied. And she said it without burden, without rancor, with a simplicity that wouldn't have been possible before. She was aware that that day still stirred certain things in her, but she also knew that it no longer defined who she was. The important thing wasn't the event, but the fact that she could choose how to live, who to have around her, and what memories to make. After all, this wasn't about rebuilding a life from scratch. It was about moving forward with a different perspective, one that now, finally, belonged completely to her. Months later, on a warm Sunday afternoon, Russo and Jason were cleaning out the pantry. Among old jars and utensils they no longer used, a small box appeared, sealed with gray tape. Jason picked it up with curiosity, but before he opened it, Russo stopped him. He knew instantly what it was, the box that had started it all. He'd never thrown it away, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of forgetfulness. Without saying anything, he took it in his hands, walked to the balcony, and placed it on the floor. Then he returned with a lighter and a metal tray. With firm movements, he broke the seal, emptied its contents now worthless and threatening, and burned it silently, watching the smoke dissipate in the air. It wasn't a ritual, nor a metaphor. It was a practical decision, a closure, something pending that, finally, no longer weighed on him. When the fire died down, Russo sat next to Jason. They didn't talk about what he'd just done. There was no need to. In that shared stillness, there was a profound certainty. The life they'd built together was free of the shadows of before. Not because the past was gone, but because she no longer allowed it to define him. Over time, she learned that true strength isn't in withstanding everything thrown at you, but in having the courage to let go of what hurts, even if it comes with the last name you've carried since birth. And so, without fanfare or witnesses, Russo closed the darkest cycle of her life, not as a victim, but as someone who chose truth, peace, and dignity. Because in the end, that's what family is too, what you choose to keep, and what you learn to let go.